I've waited 18 months to do this, so I'm really excited. Thanks everyone for coming. My name's Patricia Warby, and I'm a therapist, but I'm also a scientist by training, and I've just come into this field of health and well-being through my own experience. So I'm aiming to take you through a little bit of my story and also some of the theory of what I've learned over the years about the importance of the mind and how it works with the body in the creation of health and disease. So without further ado, let's see if this works. Yeah, so here I am. That's my sort of professional pose. Okay, just a little bit about me then. To begin with, I wrote a book last year, and I did so because I wanted to distill some of these ideas. But I wanted to also tell the story of why I got involved in doing what I now do. And I think something like the first sentence says, I'm a child of the 1970s with a normally dysfunctional childhood. And what I mean by that is that on the surface, I had a very ordinary upbringing. My parents didn't divorce, I wasn't subject to abuse or neglect. But under the surface, I had a lot of things that did actually make me the person I am, a very sensitive person. My father was chronically ill for most of my childhood, and he actually died when I was 19, which was a really big shock to the whole family, even though if any of you have had that sort of experience where you're expecting someone and they're always ill, but you never really are prepared for someone to die, particularly when you are still in the prime of your life. And it was quite a shock for me. And it was the first day of my university term, the first day of the first term, the first year. And so I was asked to come home by my mother. She wanted me to give up and take a year out. And I didn't, because I just couldn't face her grief as well as my own, because my coping mechanism at that time was to just ignore it and to carry on and carry on. And you'll see that that's definitely a picture of my life, is just kind of, don't look at it and it'll go away. So anyway, it didn't work, I can tell you that. Some other very interesting things about my family. I had an uncle who periodically would come and visit with his wife, who it turned out was my half-brother, but I didn't find out until I was 14 when my parents decided to tell me, because I was old enough then, apparently, to understand. But it was a really, really big shock, because A, I didn't know my father had been married before my mum, let alone had a child, or that his first wife had died in childbirth. So it was this kind of hidden secret that suddenly burst forth into our family, and my uncle was no longer my uncle, he was my brother. I should say now, of course, everything's great and we're the best of friends and everything, but it really shakes the foundation of who you think you are when what you take for granted as a child is suddenly shifted in a very significant way. So anyway, I don't want to go on and on about my childhood, but it had its little quirks, let's say. So the bereavement and the chronic illness was very, very key to my upbringing. And in fact, I ended up being quite an anxious young adult, although I don't know if anything like you, but you tend to assume the way you are is normal. So I had no idea how anxious I was until I got ill, which actually happened. It has been the greatest learning experience actually when I got ill, but obviously at the time it was really awful. But it has taken me in a new life direction. I got a sort of chronic fatigue style illness when I was about 32, and it knocked me for 6. I basically ended up bedridden for about 3-4 months, and I was being nursed by my mum. I couldn't go out the house, I was agoraphobic. I couldn't walk because I was so fatigued. So it's hard to imagine now that was the truth, but it really was. But as I say, I don't look at it as a terrible thing. I look at it as it's completely changed my life, and I have come to the realization that a lot of what happens in life leads you into new directions. And so what can be construed as perhaps a disaster actually has a silver lining. Okay, so, and then I wrote this book on trauma and emotional healing. And I remember putting it forward to a few people, you know, I'm going to write this book. Oh, what's it about? Trauma. They're like, really? Are you sure you want to write a book on trauma? That sounds a bit depressing. And I said, no, it's not going to be depressing. It's going to be really exciting because I realise how important trauma is in the story of healing. And I've come the other side. So I see it as a really positive thing. So anyway, I wrote the book and that's now out. But you might ask, why trauma therapy? Why have I, of all things, got involved in something that's actually quite painful and difficult? And so here I'd like to just tell you a little story that actually happened to me about 5 years ago, I'd say. I had just trained to be a massage therapist. That's what when I got well, massage was really helpful to me. I found it really beneficial. So I thought, I'm going to become a massage therapist, and that's what I did. And I had been in practice about a year, so I was still really new. And I had a lady come and see me, and she said she wanted some healing for stress, which is what a lot of people come and see you for, of course. And she lay on the table, and as ever, I started to center the energy over the body. So I just placed a hand over the back of the neck and also on the sacrum. So I just did that, and I very lightly touched the back of her neck, which for most people is rather lovely. You know, it makes you feel safe and secure, and it begins the treatment. But something rather extraordinary happened. She jumped as if I jolted her with a voltage. And then she started to convulse and choke, basically. And blood was coming from her nose as she was choking. And obviously she got off the bed, and I was sort of not knowing what on earth I had done. And it was really scary. In all the training that you get as a massage therapist, you never get... Nobody tells you what to do if somebody is having a flashback, which is what was actually happening in this case. Now, I didn't know much about this at all, but I had the presence of mind in that moment to touch her on the shoulders and just say, you're here and you're safe, because I could see something going on in her eyes that showed me she wasn't really present in the room. She was somewhere else. She was reliving something really extraordinary and not very pleasant. Anyway, it does have a happy ending, that story. We did carry on working together, and she and I actually learnt a lot from each other. She taught me a lot about trauma, and it was her instigation that I actually learnt how to do trauma therapy. And she's healthy today. In fact, I thought she might come today, but she hasn't. But you know, she's managing to lead a really good life. But just to tell you that kind of experience can be more common than you think. And the instance for her was the touch, and I will come back to that. It was the touch that I made on the back of her neck that triggered an old memory, and touch is really, really powerful in rekindling certain memories. So that's why trauma, really. I sort of was led into it by serendipity, really. Now I've got a question. What is the mind? Do we really understand what the mind actually is? I have a few theories which I'm going to put forward, but I'm really open to anything that you have to say or contribute. So please, this isn't, you know, a lecture. It's very interactive, hopefully. So I wonder. Neuroscience tells us that it's the sum total of information flow. It's just a series of electrical impulses that flow along certain neural pathways in the brain and spinal cord. And it's the sort of response of that neural flow. But really, they haven't a clue how mind comes about from that neuronal electricity. If you ask a psychologist, on the other hand, they'll say, well, it's the seat of human consciousness and thought, which is housed in the brain. Because we know, because we've studied the brain, and there's all this electrochemical activity. But then my question is, well, but what about the body? Is there a body element to mind as well? And I'm going to answer that one later on. Medicine, if you ask a doctor, they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, we don't deal with that. So they kind of ignore it completely and avoid the question. So actually, you won't probably get an answer from medicine on that one. They'll probably send you in the direction of a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist. And then I didn't want to leave this one out because you guys are all a bit alternative, and metaphysics, of course, is something that's become really, really key to me now, where we look at something beyond the physical. We look at the energy of mind, and we say that the brain is really just receiving this external signal, which may or may not be in the brain. In fact, it's more likely to be external to the brain. And the brain is simply like a radio receiver or a TV tuner that receives the signal, but the signal isn't in the brain itself. It's external, maybe. And therefore, this external consciousness, when it's tuned into, becomes a singular mind. But of course, that's only while we're alive. And when we die, you could say consciousness returns to source. And so it's really dependent on the quality of this physical housing while we're alive. So those are my sort of ideas. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on what mind is, or is it too mind-boggling to think about this early in the evening? But they're just a few conflicting ideas. The important thing for you to note is that nobody really knows yet. I think we're going to find out very, very soon. I really feel we're at a real crossroads with our understanding.
I think something I read about was a really good scientist. He wrote The Honeymoon thing.
Oh, Bruce Lipton. Yeah, I've got the biology.
If you touch the skin,
yeah.
So your skin is the brain. Because
oh yes, because of transduction, well, cellular transduction as well. Yeah, yeah. There's all sorts of theories. I'm going to just go a little bit into the brain because I think the brain is a really fascinating part of the body, and particularly when you look at it from an evolutionary viewpoint, which I don't know if any of you ever have, because we tend to assume the human brain is the pinnacle of evolution. But I don't know. I think there are some other very intelligent animals on the planet. But just to look a little bit at the triune brain theory, which shows us that we started with something very primitive in our evolutionary history when we were reptiles, before we evolved into human beings. And the reptilian brain, we still possess that. It's at the base of the current brain, on top of the spinal cord. And it's called the brainstem and the cerebellum, which is this shaded area here. And then over time, we developed a bit more sophistication when we needed to adapt to heat and cold, because reptiles really only are able to heat up in the sun, and then they have to go to sleep after that because they can't modify their body temperature very well. We needed something a bit more sophisticated, and we developed a limbic system, which is in the middle of the brain. And that's a mammalian brain, if you like, from our mammalian ancestors. And we share that with apes and many of the other mammals. And again, that's also still within us. But wrapped around that is, of course, the cortex, or neocortex, which is the big rubbery jelly-like two hemispheres that you've probably all seen in TV programs and things like that. So 3 evolutionary stages, and we possess all 3 of these still. And their intercommunication is really, really key as to how you feel about yourself and the world. We tend to think we're only operating from the cortex, that we're all logical, analytical, reasonable people, until we get into an emotional situation. I'm sure a few people are nodding. I know how I am when I'm because I'm not logical or rational at all. I get completely hijacked by my limbic system. And of course, that turns off the cortex and means that your behavior is coming from a place of survival. And that's why we tend to say awful things to each other. That's probably why Donald Trump appeals to certain members of the population, without getting too political. you know, because they're operating limbically, and he says all the things that they've been thinking, you know, from their emotional brain. What's really, really key for you to understand is that these last two, the limbic system and the brainstem, are unconscious. They're below consciousness. We don't always know why we feel the way we do or why we behave the way we do. And so it's about 90, some people say 95% of our function, of our behaviour, is driven by these unconscious processes of survival, safety, and wanting to be loved, you know, because that's a really strong emotion. Great, isn't it? When you think of it like that we're not actually who we think we are. In fact, that was one slide I missed out because I thought, oh, I don't want to have too many slides, but who are you? You know, who do you think you are? And I think that's where illness actually changed my view of myself, because I thought I was logical and I could do anything and I was a really capable person until I got ill. So a little bit more detail then. So the unconscious brain, really, really important. It's in the middle. If I were to do this is obviously a slice through, so it's not easy to show you, but the middle part there is the limbic system. It's this green and blue bit, and I don't want to go into an anatomy lesson, but you do need to know something about this because you need to know why they are important and why they fire at certain times. The bit I particularly want you to remember is the amygdala, and if you can, the hippocampus, because they're really, really key for memory and stress. They're part of our stress system. Amygdala is like a smoke alarm. If I came into the room today and, I don't know, there was a fire alarm that suddenly went off, it would be my amygdala which would be saying, run, run, danger, danger, you know, do something. My hippocampus is all about storing memory and encoding a sort of context. In other words, if then a message came on and said, this is a test, thank you for your attention, it'd be the hippocampus that would say, it's a false alarm, you're okay. And those two working together are the sort of parts of the brain that enable us to react to certain situations. The others, I'm not going to go so much into, but the colour coding, by the way, trauma changes the size of these parts of the brain, and the parts that are in red there, the amygdala, insula and thalamus, they increase in size during and after trauma, whereas the two blue ones, the hippocampus and the hypothalamus, actually they shrink a bit. So your brain is plastic. I don't know if you knew that, but it does actually shrink and change dependent on your environment. So I like this diagram because this is 3D, so it sort of shows you that the slice showed you that it was in the middle, but what this one shows you is there's actually a left and a right side. So there are two amygdala, and there are two hippocampi, and there are two of all of them. So there's a left and a right, and a lot of books miss that out, and actually they're not exactly the same. And the right tends to be more damaged in trauma. So what I'm basically saying is a stressful experience, and we call that emotional trauma, landscapes the brain. It changes the way the brain functions. It makes certain parts grow and certain parts shrink. It changes the mind's function, therefore, and it's usually for life. And there's a little star there, and it says, unless mitigated. In other words, unless you have someone who helps support you through something, or you have a sense of safety, or you find a therapy that really helps you, or you find some creative outlet that allows you in life to live meaningfully and overcome some of the trauma that you've had. So I use the word trauma very loosely, by the way. And I'll go into that more, but anything that's emotional that was in a state of helplessness, that's my definition. So stress, generally, we all understand, well, we think we know what stress is. Stress is trying to find a new place when you're coming here and you're not sure where you're coming, and you're trying to find the car park and you're not sure if you've got enough time and all that sort of thing. That's a really obvious stress. And what it does to the body is it sets off this whole cascade, neurological and hormonal, and it just sort of fires off all these messages throughout the brain and the body. But and this is basically what's called the HPA axis, and that's the hypothalamus. Remember, that was the one at the top in the diagram. Pituitary, which is just below it, and an adrenal cortex, which is just above your kidneys and your back. But stress need not just be overt and obvious, like the example I've just described. Stress can also be unconscious. Say there's someone in this room right now who reminds you of someone that hurt you when you were little. You'll avoid them. I know, because I had someone come, and a new colleague joined our work team, and I couldn't work out, I don't like her. I didn't like her, just didn't like her energy, I didn't like who she was. And then it suddenly dawned on me, she reminds me of someone that really hurt me. And after that, I got on fine with her, because I started to see her as the person she was and not who the person she reminded me of. So stress can be really unconscious. It can be a reminder of something, it can be a look, a feeling, a time of year. A lot of people get symptoms at a certain time of year, and then if you trace it back, it's due to something that happened at this time of year, a bereavement, a loss, a divorce, something really traumatic for them. They've forgotten the link, but their subconscious mind hasn't. And I'm sorry, I know this is really complicated, and please don't feel you have to take it all in, but how does the brain transmit these feelings of stress to the body? Well, it does it through what's called the autonomic nervous system. And autonomic you can think of as automatic, it's almost the same. It's all the bits that happen when you're not thinking about them. Your blood is pumping. Your brain is working out how acidic your blood is, and it's adjusting everything. It tells you when you're thirsty. You're not thinking about that, but it's happening. And so all of these functions are happening from the brain to various organs of the body along two branches. One's called parasympathetic, and that's the one that slows everything down and makes you feel comfortable. It's called rest and digest. It's when you've just had Sunday lunch and you're thinking, life is good. And so that's your parasympathetic system. And then you've got your sympathetic, which is the fight and flight mechanism. Have any of you heard of fight and flight? Is that something you've come across? Yeah. So that if somebody came at me now and was going to abuse me or tell me I'm rubbish and I'm really boring and I should sit down, which I'm sure a lot of you are thinking actually, that would be really threatening to me, and my heart would start to race, and I'd have no control over that because I would just feel really uncomfortable. And so that's the kind of unconscious stress that these two are kind of involved in. And up until about 15 years ago, this is what we understood to be the sum total of how the human organism controlled its stress response. It was these two branches, on or off. And it was the nice yin and yang balance of these two which enabled us to feel either happy or miserable. Up until about 15 years ago. And then a new idea came on the scene. And when I read this, it really blew me away because it really made sense of some of the things that I've seen in my clinic and also some of the things that I have experienced myself. There is another level to the parasympathetic system, and it's based on the vagus nerve, which runs from your brainstem to most of the organs of your body, as I showed you, but also it runs to the head and neck. It controls eye movements, swallowing, balance, middle ear balance is very involved with the vagus nerve as well. And you'll see when I talk about some of the symptoms, I think this is really, really key as to why we get some of the symptoms we do when trauma is re-triggered in the brain. So vagus nerve then comes down, as I've said, to most of the organs of the body, including the reproductive areas, gut, heart, liver, lungs, kidneys, and all these muscles and control systems of the head and neck. So it's really, really key. And when this was discovered by a guy called Stephen Porges, it was coined polyvagal theory because they were saying there were several branches of the vagus nerve which they hadn't known about before and that innervate this part of the head and neck. Which if you think about it, when you're a baby and you're learning how to be in the world, what do you connect with? You connect with the eyes and the smile of your mother. You're cooed at, hopefully, if you're with a mother who's, able and pleasant. You're tickled, you're cuddled, you're stroked, you're fed, hopefully, when you're hungry. But all of that is communicated through the eye gaze and through touch. And that's where we come back to this notion of touch being really, really key. And so actually, there are 3 levels now we know of. So there's 2 parasympathetic systems, and they're at different levels in the evolution of the brain and also in the parts of the body. With the sympathetic in the middle, that's the fight and flight one. Now, you don't need to know all of this, but as I've said, the head and neck is really, really key because it's part of this more evolutionary advanced. It came later in our development as human beings. And it's important for emotion and communication, of safety and love. And so it's what's called our social engagement system. And in life, if you are subject to threat, it's your social engagement system that comes online. A little baby who is in an unsafe environment will reach for mother. Initially, the baby will reach for mother unless they're rejected. They're looking for support and help to make them feel safe again. So that's the first option for a human baby or toddler. But after that, they've got 2 more options, fight and flight, or finally, if that doesn't work, and in childhood it very seldom does because you're not in a control situation where you can normally fight back or run away. You can go into this third dorsal vagal system, which is to do with all these organs below the neck, which is subject to a freeze response. And that's a reptilian state of living. And that, I think, is what happened to me when I had the final straw in my life, which was the final stressor. I had gone through social engagement, trying to be on top and make it in the world. And I tried fighting, keep going, keep going, keep going. And in the end, my body just said enough, and it went into freeze. And that's when I got fatigue. It's when I got, I shook all the time. I couldn't sleep, terrible insomnia. But so when I read this, you can imagine it's sort of like, that was me. I understand that now. I understand what was going on. My body had just closed down. But the question is, what was the threat for me, and what is the threat for most people? So that's the work of Stephen Porges in America. But it's such, when you come across a theory that just sort of lights you up and makes you feel like, that's brilliant. Now, we don't know that it's absolutely 100% correct, but it certainly does explain a lot of things that happen in therapy, and it explains a lot of the sort of situations we're now seeing with children who are suffering depression and, terrible stress early in life. So this freeze response then can come about through several different ways. The threats that children have are not necessarily obvious. Poor attachment to parent is one that I've already hinted at. So I'm a little child. If I reach to mummy and mummy says, "Oh, get away," or she says, "Oh gosh, what's the matter?" and she's really, really scared, her eyes and her body language communicate to me that I'm somehow unsafe. And so, and that starts really, really young. And if that continues as a pattern, the child, read me, never feels quite fully attached to their parent. And my mum is still alive, bless her, so I'm not going to be, it's not about blame. It's just about noting that I never really had that sense of being right for her. I wasn't right for her, and she wasn't right for me. Her temperament and mine never quite matched, So I'm definitely one of the poor attached people. I have made a lot of healing approaches to my mum, and we do have a good relationship now, but she's not my best friend. Some people come to me and they say, "Oh, my mum's my best friend." It's like, really? Okay. Great if you have that, if you really have that connection, wonderful, but so many people don't. It's only about 30 to 40% we think of the population that have really good attachment, parental attachment. So actually it's not that common. Another threat can be bullying in childhood, which, yep, did anyone else have it? I did. I'm not the only one, surely. So I was routinely bullied because I was a ginger, you know, as they call them now. And back in 1973, 4, 5, it wasn't that common. And there were only 2 of us in the school. And you can imagine a boy and a girl. So we were always put together. And I can remember, you know, people laughing and staring, particularly when I started to hit puberty and I got underarm hair and that was ginger as well. And, you know, goodness me, I mean, I can make light of it now, but life was hell at school. It was awful. And so what did I do? I shut down. I just got on with life and I just got into reading books and I became the SWAT and I just got really, you know, I just ignored them basically is what I did. But if that happens to you and you have it routinely, it becomes a cumulative trauma that changes your brain. If you are ignored in any way, that your needs are ignored, I mean, so you somehow aren't met, you aren't held in life, or you're sent away, even worse. A lot of this attachment theory came about through the guy that looked at the children who were evacuated from London during the Blitz, and he found that by far and away the children that stayed with their parents despite all the bombs did far better than the children who were evacuated away from their parents. So there is a lot about being sent away to boarding schools or you know, losing that connection with parents. Sorry, this might be a bit negative at this point. I do get more positive, I promise you. Chronic humiliation, abuse, betrayal, illness, these are all pretty obvious threats. But also observing that in someone else. If you're a child and you observe someone else subject to threat or bullying and that you love that person and they are significant to you, that is a trauma for you because it's a vicarious trauma. You're seeing it and you're feeling as if you need to do something. So finally, you know, if you had no one to support you or you felt wrong or you were labelled, dare I say, sensitive like I was. Oh, you're so sensitive. You've got to toughen up. And I was. Oh my God, I still am. If somebody, you know, tells me, yeah, I didn't like what you did there, I'll be like, oh, really? It's awful for me. I don't suffer criticism well. I'm still like it. So all of those things can happen early in life. The point is, I should have said, is that your brain is still forming before the ages of about 22, 23. And guys, your brains are a bit slower than the ladies here. Yours form about 25, 26, you're fully mature. Ladies, we've kind of known that, haven't we? Yeah. So, but that is often why young men are very disinhibited because the cortex hasn't fully come online until about that age, 25, 26.
Does that not affect girls as well? Because I thought it was
Of course it does.
until 25 days their brains all developed.
Yeah, I'm just saying it for men it's just a touch later. On average, and goodness, you know, of course there'll be men who mature earlier and women who mature later, but on average men are about a year or 2 later. It does affect women. Young women can be very disinhibited as well, hence all the sort of problems when they drink and, you know, which simply exacerbates. Absolutely, yeah. And that's why they go off the rails, because they have no sense of control over their emotions. So it all gets really tricky. So trauma is common and it happens through childhood events, but then it can get triggered later in life, particularly if you are a sensitive person. Not everybody suffers trauma, of course they don't, but a lot of people do. And it can be a later life event that can bring up all the emotions of the time that you had when you were young. And that's when we go into freeze response. So I wanted to look a bit about where the mind is outside the brain now. I just didn't want to just focus on the brain because I know you're all interested in mind, body, spirit stuff. So where else could we think about? What about the gut brain? Lovely lurid diagram there of your guts. You've heard of gut reactions and gut feelings and all of that. Well, there is a brain in your gut. And I'm not just making, that sound nice. There are more nerve endings in your gut than there are in your spinal cord. So your gut brain is real, and it senses things before your brain does. So it has its own nervous system, and we're just discovering, and this is latest information, which I know some of you have probably come across, but we've got this amazing ecosystem in our gut. It's not just good bacteria and bad bacteria, as we've heard up to now. It's a community that are communicating with you. They're communicating via all the little chemicals that they produce, but also they've got their own DNA. And DNA, of course, is the code of life, as you probably come across. And their DNA outnumbers yours 100 to 1. So the question is, what is a human being, actually? Are we individuals, or are we a walking community? And I'm coming to the conclusion that we are this amazingly complex community of organisms. We couldn't survive without them. They can't survive without us. We are in symbiotic relationship, but it is really fascinating. They know when you're happy or sad. They know what's going on in your life because you are communicating directly with them via these chemical signals. And their DNA is swapping with each other because they're little microbes. They reproduce fantastically quickly, and they swap their DNA over all the time. So they're creating a lot of your health and well-being if you're doing the kind of work you want to be doing, if you're telling yourself good messages in life. So they pick up all these messages from you, and they help you if they can, but if things get out of balance, it can go pretty rapidly downhill. Toxins, both external ones that we're breathing and eating, but also internal toxins, create havoc in this community. And then there's the heart brain. Has anybody ever come across this theory? Yeah, so Institute of Heart Math, it's American, so it's math, not maths, as we say, has done a lot of work on this, a lot of important research, and they've showed that actually the heart has this wonderful electromagnetic field around it. And often, if you come into a room, you can feel the energy of the people in the room. Like the energy in here is lovely, I have to say. I knew the minute I walked in, it's just, this is going to be a great evening, because there are people here who are resonating together. We're resonating with each other. We have some things in common, and we're all here because we're interested in this stuff. So, but if we went to, I don't know, a corporate function, we might not feel quite so lively. I've certainly been and thought, oh God, there's nobody here I can communicate with. And that's my heart telling me that. It's not my brain, because I don't know them yet. I haven't picked up that, but my heart has. My heart has picked up on the energy of these people, and it's sort of gone, oof, no. So they've shown, in fact, that if you show a person pictures on a computer screen very, very quickly, though they have very little time to react to them, you've got two sorts of pictures. You've got fluffy kittens and ducklings and nice things, and then you've got rather disturbing images that pop up in the middle of those. And you ask the person to kind of wear an electrode on their wrist so that you can tell the stress response. You can actually show that the heart knows before the computer brings the screen up which picture it's going to be, whether it's going to be stressful or friendly. Yeah? We've no idea quite how this works yet, but we know that it does, because there's an energy around that, and that's why I think the mind is not in the brain. I think we're picking it up via all these other systems that we have, and we're really only at the beginning of our understanding of what's going on. But I just think take your heart seriously. Your heart feelings are really key. And one of the things I always say to people when they're coming to see me is, have you checked your heart rate variability? And most people go, what? And I say it's one of the best indicators of your longevity and your health and well-being that there is. And it is so simple to do. You can get an app on your phone now that measures it via your camera on your smartphone. If most of you, I don't know if most of you have a smartphone, some of you may not. And you just put your finger over the camera and it measures your heart rate variability and it puts it out on a little screen. And I would love to have demoed this, but our technology tonight isn't up to it. But one day I will. I'll show you how you can actually change your heart rate variability. And I demoed it to a friend last week at Sainsbury's, and she was like, God, that's amazing. So what I do is I think of something really disturbing, and my heart rate variability, which isn't the same as your heartbeat, by the way. It should be like this. Up and down. But if you think of something disturbing or you've had a really tough day, it's all over the place, it's really jagged and out of sync. Then you think meditative thoughts and you get really in tune with and harmony of your life. It changes and it becomes this beautiful smooth pattern again. And that is, if you can start to learn how to do this for yourself, however you do it, whether you sing, you chant, use acupuncture, I don't know, but there are many ways of doing it. Heart rate variability is really key. How am I doing for time? Right, about 10 minutes. There's another part of your brain and body that actually is really key that you may not be aware of. Did you know that your brain has a lymphatic system? Because up until about 3-4 years ago, science didn't know about it. It thought there wasn't one. And now we know there is this fantastic drainage system in the brain which operates at night. And this is why it's really important to get good sleep. Because in sleep, the cells in the middle here, the glial cells, shrink. And that allows the fluid to pass through from one end through the venous circulation from the arterial. And that's your drainage and your neuroglial drainage. So it's been coined lymphatics because it's glial cells plus lymphatics. So sleep is really, really key to keeping your brain functional. And it might be linked with Alzheimer's, why a lot of people get Alzheimer's. That's just a picture of, it's been lit up obviously with some form of, labelling. And you'll see the difference between the brain when it's asleep, how lit up it is. It's full of flow, it's flowing. And during your awakening time, there isn't time for you to be draining your brain, you need to be thinking. So it's just this amazing drainage system. But interestingly, it's also the dumping ground for your emotions. So if you have emotions that you're not dealing with, like me, why did I get insomnia? Could this be the reason? Because that was my first symptom. I started not to be able to sleep. I would wake up early, and then the early crept even earlier until I actually couldn't get to sleep at all. I had all these emotions going on, and I had no idea. I had no idea because I wasn't feeling them. They were all subconscious. So more active when you're asleep, and it's sort of pumped through the blood and to your liver. So if you've got emotions that you're not dealing with, it's going to clog up the system. It takes a lot of energy to do this. So if you're compromised through having a chronic fatigue-related style issue, which is what I had, your energy is so low, you can't do this. And so you start to get more and more clogged, and that's why it tends to be a downward cycle. So that is all preamble towards saying that mind and body are actually not separate. They are linked in many, many ways. And so you can't ignore the mind when you're looking at healing. And a lot of people do. They think if they do all the right things and they eat the right things and do the right exercise, somehow everything will come right. And it does make a difference. But if you ignore the mind component and your emotions, you're only getting half the story. And luckily, science now agrees with this and has come up with a really long-winded phrase called psychoneuroimmunology. And that's the study of these psychological effects on the neurology and your immune system. So don't worry about the terminology. The important thing, though, is that emotions are not just in your mind. They are felt in your body. Hence you blush if you're embarrassed. You might blanch if you're ashamed or angry, but it's more subtle than that. Certain emotions are more damaging than others. And the biggies in terms of the kind of work I do are shame. God, who talks about shame, It's just so clear that all of us have it to some degree or another, but we don't talk about it because it's uncomfortable. Why would we? But it's at the heart of a lot of illness, is unresolved shame over being wrong or not listened to or somehow different from other people. Another big one is betrayal, and betrayal can be whatever you see it as. So it could be your father leaves home, or you're sent to boarding school, or someone dies. These are all betrayal in your mind because that person has left you. And fear, of course, which is a really absolutely classic emotion that we all feel from time to time. They are all profound landscapers of the brain. They change the way the brain functions, and they change the balance of all these different parts. Linked to trauma and your life events. So we're nearly going to take a break, but I just wanted to show you one more thing, which is, I'm going to ask you a question. What's the biggest killer? You've probably heard on the news recently, actually, that Alzheimer's has just taken over from heart disease as the major killer in the UK. I think it's 12% or something compared to 11. So if I asked you what the biggest killer was, you'd probably say something like heart disease or Alzheimer's. Maybe some people would say cancer. Cancer's a big one. But what's really, really unspoken and not talked about is adverse childhood experience, or ACE, i.e. another word for trauma. This is documented in all the research. You just don't hear about it in your doctor's surgery because they don't ask you about your life experience. They've got 8 minutes to see you, prescribe something and get you out. But if you looked at the experience of people who have the most health issues, you'll see that this adverse childhood experience triples your lifetime risk of heart disease. So yes, you might die of heart disease, but what's really killed you is unresolved emotional trauma. There's a 20-year difference in life expectancy between the people who have the most compared to the least. You don't believe me, I'm sure, but have a look on TED, the TED Talks, if any of you have come across TED. It's a wonderful resource and loads of stuff on there. And Nadine Burke-Harris does a wonderful TED Talk on this subject. And Nikki Greatrix, she's a nutritionist and she does a lot of talks as well on it. And it's really incredible. But because of the stress response to your body, you suddenly get more disease. And so it's actually something we really need to look at. And I just put this up. I know it's really difficult to read, but I've highlighted one here. This is the questionnaire that they gave to people when they did the ACE study. Okay, it's called your ACE score. While you were growing up, during the first 18 years of your life, and then it asks you 10 questions. And some of these are really obvious. Did people hit you, swear at you, push, grab, slap you, touch you? It's about horrible things. But there's some here that I think you might not have been aware of as trauma. And this one says, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? If yes, and you would just put yes for that. And that's an interesting one, because I would say, yes, I was loved, but no, I wasn't special. And I'm not sure our family really did look out for each other that well. We weren't very good at it. And the other one, which is interesting, I think, is, was your mother or stepmother pushed, grabbed, slapped, hit? And this is what I was referring to earlier about a child observing something and taking that on for themselves, and kids often do. It's vicarious trauma. It's observing someone that you love having a difficult time. And that's how they did it anyway. But there has been some criticism because they've missed out bereavement, they've missed out accidents, which are also significant for people, and being sent away, as I described. And they were all in my study. When I did my study a couple of years ago, I sort of used this, but then I changed it to include those things too. So trauma and unresolved emotion then is any event where helplessness is present. And that is individual to you. That's an interpretation of you in your life. So if you feel helpless in your job because you've got to be working there, but you hate it, that's a trauma. If you're in a relationship that you're unhappy in, but you can't see a way out, that's a trauma. It's recorded by the limbic system for future avoidance as an implicit memory. And that's why when I touched that lady on the back of her neck, she had this implicit memory of being touched there in a not very nice way when she was 3 or 4, and it comes back. It's instant. It's formed early in life, usually between the ages of 0 and 7. That's when your limbic system is in control. Children are totally limbic. Want, don't want, give me, no, I love this, I hate you. Some would say teenagers are there also, but it's very obvious when a child is growing up that these feelings are very unconscious. And these triggers will come and remind you of those things, but they'll do so unconsciously. And it might be a sound or a smell or a time that reminds the brain of that originating event, but you won't get a memory, unlike my lady who did. You just get a feeling or a symptom that comes up. And the awful thing is they don't decay, they don't change, and they have no words to describe them. So when you go into therapy and you start to talk about this stuff, it's very difficult because you have no words for how you feel. And you're trying to translate it as an adult and say, well, I felt completely betrayed or left, and that does something. It does help activate the brain, but it does nothing to change the way you feel. You still feel helpless. I'm very nearly there now. So it's the meaning of the event, not the event itself. And that's why it's individual. And that's why me being a really sensitive person means some of these things that other people would have brushed off and thought, oh yeah, so my uncle's my brother, you know. But for me, it was a really but what do you mean? I really was thrown by it because my sense of safety was really shaken by that. So, trauma can be accident, bereavement, birth, bullying, betrayal, surgery. I had a lot of surgery when I was little. It's another thing. I had my tonsils taken out when I was 7. And back in the day, that's what they did. They just ripped them out because they were regarded as not necessary. But I was not told until the day of the surgery that I was going into hospital. And then it was, do you want to grab your teddy in a nightdress? It's like, why? Where are we going? We're going on a special trip. Oh, are we? And then my parents, believing that this was the right thing, because bless them, that's what parents did then. They didn't tell you stuff. And then they had to leave me because they weren't allowed to stay. So for the first time in my life, I was alone, knowing that the next day I was going to have some surgery done, which I had no idea of. So that can be very traumatizing. So it's anything that happens when you're helpless in an already sensitized brain, and the meaning, as I've said before, and it's important because it becomes this self-perpetuated cycle of subconscious stress, and that's called kindling. Makes further trauma more likely, unfortunately. And so you get people who come in and they've got loads of trauma. They've had multiple accidents, terrible relationships. They can't keep their children because they're so traumatized. You know, the children get taken into care, and it's just a whole cycle of awful thing. So you get pain, you get all sorts of physiological effects in the ways that I've just shown you. But thank you for listening. I've got a bit more after the break, which is about what you can do about it, so it's a bit more positive.